2:14 a.m. Black Sea, south of Cape Tarkhankut. 8 vessels. Combined cargo, 40,000 tons of refined fuel headed for Crimean military stockpiles. In the next 6 hours, Russia's shadow fleet would find out that the coastal lane they'd treated as their safest corridor had become the most dangerous stretch of water in the theater. Welcome to Steel Horizon. I'm your host. We analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight, Operation Coastal Corridor, the Magura V5 naval drone campaign that collapsed Russia's fuel resupply network in a single night and proved again that Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine builds entirely new ways to fight. By dawn on July 14, 2026, 3 tankers would be burning on the surface of the Black Sea. 2 more would be aground in the shallows, hulls breached, crews scrambling onto an unfamiliar coastline. Russian port officials in Feodosia would quietly suspend all incoming tanker traffic, and Crimea's fuel reserves, already stretched thin after months of Ukrainian deep strike pressure, would drop below critical threshold within 72 hours. This is how 8 unmanned naval drones accomplished what a full naval fleet could not. And it started not with a launch order, but with a pattern. Intelligence fires before the trigger is pulled. That's the principle Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, has built its operational doctrine around. In the weeks before July 14th, GUR's maritime surveillance team had been watching something unusual take shape in Russian Black Sea logistics. Something that looked, on the surface, like a defensive adaptation. Something that was, in reality, a fatal mistake. Since early 2025, Russia's shadow fleet had been taking increasingly roundabout routes to reach Crimean ports. Western sanctions, drone harassment, and a string of catastrophic losses, including multiple oil tankers destroyed in open water engagements throughout 2025, had forced Russian logistics planners to rethink. Deep water routes were too exposed. Drone coverage was too persistent. The solution they landed on, implemented in late June 2026, was a coastal hugging strategy. Shallow water lanes running tight against the Crimean shoreline, close enough to land-based radar installations and short-range air defense systems that Ukrainian long-range drone attacks would theoretically be deterred by the proximity to Russian defensive assets. On paper, it was a reasonable adaptation. In practice, it was a trap they built for themselves. The GUR team tracking the routing shift hit their first obstacle in late June. 3 weeks of satellite imagery had shown the change in tanker routes, but the data was incomplete. A persistent cloud cover system over the northwestern Black Sea, warm Mediterranean air colliding with cooler continental air masses, had blanked out nearly 40% of the critical observation windows. 3 mission-critical days of imagery were simply gone. Without confirming the corridor's precise dimensions, analysts couldn't finalize grid assignments for the Magura units. The solution came from an unexpected direction. Ukrainian signals intelligence teams cross-referenced intercepted Russian Coast Guard radio traffic with timing data from the partial satellite passes, and were able to reconstruct the corridor's eastern and western boundaries with enough precision to define 3 operational grid squares. Not a perfect picture, but enough. The operation moved to the planning phase on July 3, 2026. What the GUR planners saw in that corridor wasn't a defensive advantage for Russia. It was a kill box. The shallow coastal lane, pressed between cliff faces on the landward side and open water on the seaward edge, gave tankers almost no room to maneuver. They were navigating a corridor barely 4 nautical miles wide in the narrowest sections. At the draft depths of the vessels Russia was routing through, tankers drawing 6 to 8 meters below the waterline. Any emergency deviation from the charted lane risked grounding on underwater rock formations that Ukrainian nautical survey data had mapped in exhaustive detail. Russia had chosen this route for protection. The GUR saw it as a bottleneck. Which weapon was deadlier in this operation? A. The Magura V5 naval drone. B. Long-range cruise missile strikes on port infrastructure. C. Electronic warfare suppressing the Russian Coast Guard response. Comment below. We'll come back to this. The Magura V5 is not a weapon most defense analysts were writing about in 2023. That oversight has been corrected, painfully, from the Russian side of the conflict. Developed by Ukrainian engineering teams using domestic innovation and components sourced through the International Defense Partnership Network supplying Ukraine since 2022, the Magura V5 is a surface naval drone, Fast, low profile, capable of autonomous or remote piloted operation. At approximately 5 meters in length, it rides low to the waterline, presenting a radar cross-section that challenges even modern naval detection systems. Its composite hull is non-magnetic and partially radar-absorbent. At cruising speed, it generates minimal acoustic signature. At full sprint, and the Magura can reach approximately 42 knots when closing on a target. It becomes extraordinarily difficult to intercept with conventional naval defensive measures. The warhead configuration on the Magura V5 used in this operation is estimated by OSINT analysts reviewing combat footage at approximately 300 kilograms of high explosive equivalent. Enough to catastrophically damage a vessel of the tanker class Russia was routing through the corridor. The drone uses GPS navigation for approach and a terminal guidance system for the final attack run. At distance, it can be controlled remotely. In final approach, autonomous targeting takes over, allowing the drone to track and engage even a maneuvering vessel. 8 of these systems were pre-positioned across 3 grid squares south of Cape Tarkhankut beginning July 10, 2026. Moving them into position without triggering Russian surveillance required the Magura units to transit at minimal power signatures, what drone operators later described as running silent, low speed, minimal electronic emissions. The drones were carried by surface support vessels to a transfer point approximately 60 nautical miles from the target zone, then released to proceed independently to their assigned grid positions. By July 13th, all 8 units were in position. Running silent. Waiting. Stay with me, because what happens next fundamentally changes how you understand naval drone warfare. The convoy that entered the coastal corridor on the night of July 13th-14th consisted of 8 vessels. 2 large tankers at the front of the column carrying the bulk of the fuel tonnage. Combined estimated cargo of approximately 40,000 tons of refined petroleum products, primarily diesel fuel for Russian military vehicle stockpiles in Crimea. 3 mid-sized tankers carrying mixed cargo, including aviation fuel components, and 3 smaller escort and support vessels. Coast Guard pattern ships rather than dedicated naval escorts, reflecting how deeply Russia had committed to the fiction that this corridor was low risk. Russian planning assumed coastal air defense would be the primary deterrent. The S-400 battery near Sevastopol could theoretically engage threats at extended range. Short-range systems along the coastal ridge above the shipping lane provided additional coverage. What Russian planners failed to adequately account for was that the Magura V5's terminal attack profile, fast, low, minimal signature, doesn't present the kind of target those systems are optimized to engage. The S-400 is a masterwork of anti-aircraft engineering. Against a surface-skimming naval drone already inside its minimum engagement envelope at the moment of detection, it's essentially irrelevant. At 2:14 a.m. on July 14, 2026, the first 2 Magura drones closed on the lead tankers. The 2 largest vessels in the convoy were approximately 800 meters apart, maintaining convoy spacing in the narrow corridor. Drone operators monitoring the approach via surveillance feeds reported the targets navigating precisely along the predicted lane. No deviation, no precautionary variation in course. The tankers were, as one operator later described it, doing exactly what the corridor forced them to do, going straight. The first Magura struck the bow section of the lead tanker at 2:14 a.m. and 33 seconds. The second drone reached its target 11 seconds later. Combat footage captured by monitoring systems shows 2 near-simultaneous detonations, separated by less than 400 meters, visible from the Crimean coastline as twin columns of fire rising against the pre-dawn darkness. The first 2 vessels were already taking on water. Fire was spreading through the fuel vapor above the cargo holds. And in the Russian Coast Guard Operations Center in Sevastopol, the duty watch officer had just reached for a radio that was about to tell him this night was far from over. Russian Coast Guard response was exactly what GUR planners had anticipated. Within 8 minutes of the first strikes, Russian patrol vessels began moving from Sevastopol. 2 Coast Guard cutters at elevated readiness were underway by 2:22 a.m. A third vessel sortied from Yevpatoria, the port closest to the engagement zone. Russian military communications. Portions later obtained by Ukrainian intelligence and verified by OSINT analysis of intercepted radio traffic show a rapid escalation up the response chain. By 2:30 a.m., the duty officer at Black Sea Fleet Headquarters was on the line. By 2:45 a.m., the watch commander at the S-400 battery southeast of Sevastopol had been woken and was trying to establish what had just struck 2 tankers in a supposedly defended corridor. The Maguras had already repositioned. I spent time going through the operational timeline the GUR released in the weeks after this attack, and one detail kept nagging at me: the repositioning protocol. The way the Magura units responded to the initial Russian reaction was not improvised. It was scripted into the operation plan before the first drone ever moved. Ukrainian planners had modeled the Russian Coast Guard response with enough precision that the drone repositioning was essentially pre-calculated. The Maguras didn't flee the Russian response. They moved into their next assigned positions. The most surprising thing about this operation isn't the damage from the first strike. It's what happened in the window between the Russian response mobilizing and actually arriving in the engagement zone. That window was the heart of the entire plan. The corridor's geography, which Russia believed was protective, created a specific problem for Coast Guard responders. The same shallow water constraints that kept tankers in a predictable lane also limited the approaches available to rescue and response vessels. The Coast Guard cutters couldn't simply sprint to the burning tankers at full speed. The underwater topography and sections of the corridor required navigation that slowed response and, critically, pushed Russian patrol vessels along routes the GUR had already identified and planned around. The Magura drones repositioning in the early morning darkness had a detailed chart of exactly where Russian response vessels would most likely be at any given time in the first hour after the initial strike. By 3:47 a.m., 6 of the 8 tankers had been struck. How many vessels did Ukraine's Magura drones strike in this single operation? A, 4, B, 6, C, 8. Drop your answer in the comments. Confirmed figure at the end of this video. The sequence of strikes between 2:14 a.m. and approximately 3:52 a.m. on July 14th represents one of the most sustained and effective naval drone campaigns since Ukraine's maritime operations began reshaping Black Sea warfare in 2023. Each pair of Magura units had been assigned specific target priority, the largest tankers. Those carrying the highest fuel volume were designated Priority Alpha. Coast Guard and escort vessels were secondary targets, to be engaged only if they moved to directly threaten a Magura unit's operational lane. A deliberate choice. The goal was not to eliminate the Russian Coast Guard presence. The goal was to destroy the fuel supply infrastructure. Every drone that diverted to engage a Coast Guard vessel was a drone that wasn't hitting the strategic objective. 3 tankers were left burning on the surface. The fire aboard the lead tanker struck first at 2:14 a.m., burned for nearly 9 hours before it was suppressed. Satellite imagery analysis by European monitoring organizations in the hours after the attack showed the fire visible from orbit, a massive thermal signature spreading across the northwestern Black Sea. The second tanker struck in the initial volley began breaking up at approximately 7:30 a.m. Its cargo of approximately 20,000 tons of refined fuel fed a slick of mixed petroleum products that spread across approximately 12 square kilometers of coastal water before environmental response teams could begin containment. 2 tankers attempted emergency evasive action. At approximately 3:15 a.m., the crews of 2 mid-convoy vessels, apparently receiving radio warnings from vessels ahead rather than a formal order, suggesting a breakdown in convoy command structure, attempted to break out of the corridor by turning toward the shallower inshore lane. The corridor had no inshore lane, not at the depth these vessels required. Both tankers grounded within 14 minutes of each other. The first came to rest on an underwater rock formation approximately 600 meters from the Crimean coastline, listing approximately 12 degrees to starboard. Ukrainian sources estimate the hull damage was sufficient to render the vessel non-recoverable without extensive salvage operations. The second tanker, running at emergency speed attempting to follow the first vessel's course, grounded harder, nearly perpendicular to its direction of travel, and suffered catastrophic flooding of its forward holds within 90 minutes. 6 tankers struck, 2 aground, 3 burning. The convoy Russia's logistics planners had designed as a reliable monthly resupply run no longer existed as a functional unit. Here's the take that'll probably generate some pushback. The catastrophic failure of Russian naval logistics planning in this corridor was not primarily an intelligence failure. It was a failure of institutional culture. Russian military planners were told what they wanted to hear. The coastal routing was presented to decision-makers as a solution precisely because it carried the appearance of defensive depth. Nobody in the reporting chain wanted to be the officer who pointed out that routing slow-moving tankers into a narrow, predictable corridor 4 miles wide might create exactly the targeting opportunity their adversary needed. That kind of honesty doesn't survive in hierarchical military structures. It certainly hasn't survived in the Russian military after the professional devastation of 2022 to 2025. And Ukrainian planners knew it. They built their operation around the assumption that Russia would not adapt, because adaptation requires the organizational capacity to admit error, and that capacity had been systematically removed from the Black Sea Fleet command structure. Subscribe to Steel Horizon if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the official narratives, but the tactical realities that shape outcomes. The aftermath in Crimea unfolded over the 72 hours following the attack with a predictable logic UR analysts had modeled in advance. Feodosia port authorities suspended incoming tanker traffic within 4 hours of the strike, confirmed through Ukrainian intelligence monitoring of Russian Port Authority communications. The suspension was presented publicly as a routine operational pause. Privately, Russian logistics officers at the Crimean theater command level were facing a stockpile calculation with no comfortable answers. Pre-strike fuel reserves in Crimea had already been running below optimal levels, a consequence of months of Ukrainian deep strike operations against storage facilities, pipeline infrastructure, and previous tanker convoys throughout the winter and spring of 2025 to 2026. The July 14th operation removed approximately 40,000 tons of inbound refined petroleum product from the supply chain in a single night. That figure, combined with the disruption of subsequent convoy scheduling, was enough to push Crimean fuel reserves below what Russian military planners classify as the critical operational threshold within 72 hours. Below critical threshold doesn't mean empty. It means the command calculus for Russian military operations in and around Crimea. Armor movements, aviation sortie rates, logistics vehicle scheduling had to be rewritten. Every armored vehicle movement required a prioritization decision it hadn't required before. Every helicopter sortie was calculated against a diminishing fuel ledger. The ripple effect from a single night's naval drone operation extended into the operational planning of Russian forces across the Crimean theater for weeks afterward. That's the strategic impact that doesn't show up in a body count. That's the kind of warfare Ukraine has become extraordinarily good at fighting. What do you think? Was the coastal routing decision a failure of intelligence, a failure of command culture, or something else? Drop your analysis in the comments. We read every one. The drone operators who conducted this mission were not operating from naval vessels. They were working from a facility well within Ukrainian-controlled territory, running their units via secure satellite data links established as a critical component of Ukraine's maritime warfare infrastructure. The physical distance between operators and targets exceeded 400 kilometers in some cases. Yet the engagement unfolded with a precision that in-person naval combat rarely achieves. This is the defining tactical reality of Ukraine's maritime drone program. The operators are not at risk. The Magura units are expendable systems. Russia cannot respond to a Magura attack by targeting the crew conducting it, because the crew is hundreds of kilometers away. This asymmetry, which Ukraine has exploited with extraordinary effectiveness since the program began delivering operational results, fundamentally changes the risk calculus of naval operations. Put yourself in the position of a Russian naval commander in Sevastopol watching this operation unfold on a radar screen at 3 a.m. Your coastal air defense systems are online. Your Coast Guard is responding. Your communications networks are functioning. And you are completely unable to engage the threat systematically destroying your convoy because the systems making it happen are not somewhere you can reach. The operators are beyond your range. The drones are too small and too fast for your defensive systems to reliably intercept before they reach their targets. And the corridor you believed was protection has become a chute your convoy cannot escape. One detail that stuck with me when reviewing the intercepted Russian communications that came through Ukrainian intelligence channels in the days after this operation. There are moments in those transcripts where senior officers, clearly under pressure, start suggesting that Ukrainian operatives must have had assets on the Crimean shoreline providing terminal guidance for the drones. The alternative, that 8 unmanned systems operating autonomously and semi-autonomously had executed a 6-hour, multi-target naval strike campaign with this level of precision, was apparently more difficult to accept than a theory of human infiltration they couldn't prove. By the afternoon of July 14th, the Russian Black Sea Fleet Command had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The coastal routing experiment, the supposed defensive innovation implemented with considerable confidence less than 3 weeks earlier, had produced a catastrophic result. The question now was what to replace it with. And the answer Russian military planners were deeply reluctant to acknowledge was that there may not be a safe route. Ukrainian drone coverage in the Black Sea had reached a level of sophistication and persistence that was closing off options faster than Russian planners could generate new ones. But the story wasn't over yet, because in the days that followed, intelligence would reveal this wasn't simply a tactical success. It was the opening move in a coordinated campaign. The full scale of material losses from the July 14th operation took days to assess. Ukrainian military sources, cross-referenced with OSINT analysis of maritime insurance databases and commercial shipping tracking services, the Shadow Fleet's operators had imperfectly concealed their vessels from, estimated the combined value of tanker losses, vessels destroyed, grounded, and damaged, at between 180 and 240 million US dollars. That figure doesn't include the value of the lost cargo. 40,000 tons of refined petroleum product either burned, dumped into the Black Sea through hull breaches, or rendered unrecoverable by the two groundings. Including cargo, the total material loss from a single 6-hour operation involving 8 unmanned drones almost certainly exceeded $300 million. Compare that to the cost of the Magura V5 units used in the operation. Ukrainian defense industry sources haven't released official pricing, but OSINT analysts and defense procurement experts who have reviewed available data estimate each Magura V5 at approximately 400,000 to 600,000 US dollars, depending on configuration and warhead load. 8 units, a maximum operational cost of approximately $5 million, against $300 million in Russian losses. A kill ratio that defense economists will be citing in academic papers for a decade. Real tactics, real consequences. Steel Horizon. If you believe that innovation and precision defeat mass and tradition in modern warfare, type Steel Horizon in the comments, because that principle is exactly what this operation demonstrated. The international dimensions of this campaign are worth examining. The Magura V5's development was supported by a network of Western defense technology partnerships Ukraine has cultivated carefully since 2022. Composite hull materials sourced through NATO partner supply chains, navigation and guidance system components, some of them derivatives of commercial drone technology modified for military application, tracing their origins to partnerships with European and American defense technology firms. The satellite communication links that allowed Ukrainian operators to control Magura units at 400-kilometer range used infrastructure developed in partnership with Western communications providers. This was not a Ukrainian operation conducted with Ukrainian weapons alone. It was a Ukrainian operation conducted by Ukrainian operators using a weapons system that represents the collective defense industrial capacity of a partnership Russia's leadership consistently dismissed as irrelevant. That dismissal has cost Russia at least $300 million in a single night. The cumulative cost of that dismissal, measured across 4 years of conflict, is a number Russian defense planners cannot afford to calculate honestly. What would NATO have done differently in planning an operation like this? Comment your analysis below. Genuinely curious to see your tactical thinking on this one. The lessons of July 14th are not subtle. They don't require careful parsing. They're direct, demonstrable, and already being studied in military academies across NATO partner nations. First, predictability in logistics routing is existential vulnerability. Russia chose its coastal corridor because it appeared safe. That appearance of safety was the weapon Ukraine used to define the kill zone. Any military logistics system that routes through a predictable lane, regardless of what defensive assets nominally cover that lane, is creating a targeting opportunity for an adversary with the patience to wait for it. Second, unmanned systems operating at range fundamentally alter the risk calculus of maritime warfare. The Magura V5 units were not risking Ukrainian personnel. Their operators were not at sea. Russia could not respond to the attack by targeting the operators, the command infrastructure, or the decision-making chain that authorized the operation. It could only respond to the drones themselves, and by the time its response arrived, the drones had repositioned. Third, the integration of intelligence with targeting is the force multiplier that determines whether a capable weapon becomes a decisive one. 8 Magura drones are a capable weapon. 8 Magura drones deployed against a corridor precisely mapped by weeks of OSINT, satellite imagery, and signals intelligence analysis, targeting a convoy whose schedule and routing were known in advance, operating with repositioning protocols pre-calculated against the anticipated Russian response. That is a decisive weapon. Ukraine has learned to combine capability with intelligence-driven precision in a way its adversary has consistently failed to match. We'll say what most analysts won't. Russia's Black Sea Fleet command failure on the night of July 14th was not primarily a tactical failure. It was a doctrinal failure. The decision to route shadow fleet tankers through a coastal corridor was made by an institution that had internalized the idea that proximity to defensive assets equals safety. A lesson drawn from Soviet-era conventional warfare doctrine that was obsolete before it was applied. Ukraine operates from a different doctrine. The weapon doesn't need to be near the target. The intelligence needs to be precise. The planning needs to account for the adversary's response. The operation needs to deny the adversary any decision point at which adaptation becomes possible. On the night of July 14th, Russia had no decision point. The convoy was committed. The corridor was defined. The kill box was set. Ukraine executed the plan. Will operations like this one force a fundamental change in how Russia routes Black Sea logistics within the next 6 months? Comment why yes or no. Your prediction matters, and we're tracking the outcomes. Now, the answer you've been waiting for. How many vessels did Ukraine's Magura V5 drones strike in the July 14th coastal corridor operation? The answer is C. 8 vessels were struck. Not 6, not 4. All 8 vessels in the convoy were engaged. 6 were struck by direct drone attack during the operational window between 2:14 a.m. and approximately 3:52 a.m. 2 additional vessels, the tankers that attempted to break out of the corridor and run for shallower water, were struck indirectly by the geography of the kill box itself. They ran aground. Their hulls were breached, not by drone warheads, but by the underwater rock formations that the corridor's geometry made unavoidable the moment those crews decided that staying in formation was more dangerous than maneuvering. The kill box completed itself. Ukraine's planners designed a situation where Russian decision-making, whether to stay in the corridor or break for shallow water, produced damage regardless of which choice was made. That's the highest form of tactical planning. Not merely defeating the adversary's response, but designing conditions where every possible adversary response serves your objective. Was routing the convoy through the coastal lane the right strategic decision for Russian logistics planners? Could Crimea's fuel supply network have been better protected with a more dispersed resupply strategy? And what would you have done differently in designing the drone interdiction plan from the Ukrainian side? Drop your analysis below. We genuinely study these comments for the patterns in how different audiences think about tactical decisions. The Black Sea is quieter now, in the days after July 14th, 2026. Quieter in the specific way that operational pauses create. Not peace, but the held breath between actions. Russian tanker traffic has not resumed through the coastal corridor. The vessels are not moving because the corridor is no longer a viable route, and Russian logistics planners have not yet found a replacement that doesn't carry its own version of the same vulnerability. The 2 grounded tankers remain visible on satellite imagery, listing against the Crimean coastline in the pre-dawn light. Visible from orbit, silent reminders that modern maritime warfare punishes predictability without mercy. Subscribe to Steel Horizon. We break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. Steel Horizon. Stay vigilant.